stories that immerse you in the darkness of the time. However, one of the least explored and darkest sides of this tragic conflict was the discrimination and ruthless violence against homosexuals. Considered a threat to the purity of the dominant Aryan race, same-sex relationships were brutally condemned as crimes of degeneration. This unleashed a series of atrocious punishments, inhumane experiments, rapes, murders, and unimaginable torture. In this new military history video, you will learn about the heartbreaking experiences of 4 men whose testimonies reveal the atrocities and humiliations they suffered simply for being gay. Their stories not only chronicled their own struggles, but also illuminated the lives of many others who were affected by this terrible chapter in history. Join us on this journey through time as we explore the shocking reality of homosexuals in Nazi Germany. Like many others, they crossed the gates of hell, although under the banner of wearing the striped uniform and an inverted pink triangle that identified them as homosexuals. In their wake, a mockery and their name on a pink list that placed them in the lowest stratum, among those who seemed like they could no longer suffer. Throughout Central Europe, rules criminalizing homosexuality were a reality. In countries such as France, Germany, and Austria, the dreaded paragraph 175 was established, a legal provision that made any man susceptible to arrest, prosecution, and prosecution for showing homosexual inclinations. However, before Nazism took over European governments, these laws had little impact, as issues related to sexuality were considered part of the private sphere. In Germany, there was a period of relative tranquility for the gay community, which came to an end with Hitler's rise to power. Immediately, laws that defined the desirable characteristics of a citizen began to exclude behaviors and lifestyles considered undesirable. From that moment on, homosexual individuals found themselves harassed and excluded from the public sphere and social recognition. This drastic change marked the beginning of systematic persecution that would leave an indelible scar on the history of the gay community during the Nazi era. It is estimated that between 5,000 and 15,000 homosexuals were prisoners in Nazi concentration camps, where they were identified with the infamous pink triangle. In this ruthless environment, the mortality rate reached a terrifying 60%. Considerably higher than that of other persecuted groups. Hunger, disease, exhaustion, beatings, and murder emerged as common causes of death in this dark chapter of history. Below, we will explore the cut-short lives of those who suffered these cruel fates and the consequences they left on the gay community during these dark years. Bertram Schaffner, a man caught in between two worlds. Bertram Schaffner's story is distinguished by the roles he played as a German-American in the tumultuous era that saw the rise of Nazi Germany and World War II. Born on November 12, 1912, to a German-American father and a German mother, Bertram grew up in a Jewish family in Erie, Pennsylvania. His mother, Margaret Rosenbaum Schaffner, came to the United States a few years earlier at the insistence of her father, who wanted her to marry an American. Margaret's marriage, arranged under special circumstances, led Bertram's mother to spend long periods traveling between the United States and her native Germany, taking Bertram with her on trips of up to 6 consecutive months. In his testimony, Bertram shares that during his youth, he felt that he lived between two worlds, neither fully American nor fully German. This duality will become a central element of his unique experience during these crucial moments in history. Due to his training as a psychiatrist, Bertram Schaffner was recruited as a medical officer in 1940, stationed at Governor's Island in New York. His responsibility was to evaluate the mental fitness of recruits for military service, with a particular focus on identifying those suspected of being homosexual. While gays were officially expected to be dishonorably discharged, instead of following this protocol, Schaffner wove a different narrative and thus managed to chart a path of hope. Schaffner found unusual arguments for granting honorable discharges, giving these men the possibility of building a new civilian life after fulfilling their military duty. In this delicate balance between imposed rules and empathy, he created a powerful story that challenged conventions and offered those fighting for their identity a light of redemption in the midst of darkness. Something similar to what Oskar Schindler did, a German businessman who saved the lives of thousands of Jews during the Holocaust, employing them as workers in his factories. His story was immortalized in the movie Schindler's List. This turn in Bertram Schaffner's medical work reveals the moral and human complexity he faced during a tumultuous historical period. In 1982, in the heart of New York, Schaffner wrote a bold chapter in the history of psychiatry by co-founding the pioneering organization Gay and Lesbian Psychiatrists. In an era where the shadow of the closet hung over the profession, Schaffner once again bravely bucked convention by being one of the first psychiatrists to speak out on behalf of sexual diversity. In this scenario of taboos and silences, Schaffner led a revolutionary movement, challenging the social and professional restrictions that kept the gay community in the shadows. His bravery resonated at a time when authenticity and acceptance were a monumental challenge. His legacy endures as a testimony of resistance and change in a time when freedom of expression and authenticity were truly revolutionary acts. Albrecht Becker, an example of resilience. The next case that we are going to analyze in this video is that of Albrecht Becker, who provided exceptional testimony in 1997 at the age of 91. Born in 1906 in the city of Thale, he moved to Würzburg at the age of 18, finding in this new location, far from his family, the freedom to live openly as a gay man. His life took a significant turn when he began a long-term relationship with Joseph Arbert, a professor more than 20 years his senior. Arbert became Becker's intellectual mentor, introducing him to the fascinating world of art and literature. However, this union was cut short when the Gestapo arrested them in 1935. Becker recalls the atmosphere that permeated homosexuals in Nazi Germany, highlighting the sense of security that prevailed. This feeling of relative confidence, despite Article 175, was largely attributed to the fact that the commander of the fanatic youth groups that served Hitler, known as the SA, Ernst Röhm, was homosexual. The general belief was that since Röhm could be openly gay as a Nazi leader, homosexuals in Germany could live without restrictions. However, the Night of the Long Knives in June 1934 radically changed this panorama. The internal power struggle between Röhm and his growing SA army against Hitler culminated in the assassination of hundreds of political enemies, including Röhm, within days. The consequences were the consolidation of Hitler's power as supreme leader and the creation of an extremely dangerous environment for homosexuals living in Nazi Germany. This dramatic turn in Becker's story illustrates the profound impact of political events on the lives of those who fought for their identity and freedom in a time of great adversity. In early 1935, Albrecht Becker received a summons to appear at the police station and face interrogation. The officer in charge, a man named Guerin, asked Becker if it was true that he was homosexual. "Of course," Becker replied. "Everyone in Hamburg knows I'm gay." In the course of the interview, he inadvertently incriminated Dr. Arbert, his mistress, who was arrested by the Gestapo the next day. Becker was detained for 3 months until the trial took place. In an intriguing, ironic twist, it was his attitude of admitting his crimes that finally granted him the chance to escape the concentration camps. Although he was found guilty, he was only sentenced to 3 years in prison in Nuremberg. The other defendants who did not acknowledge the charges were sent to the Dachau concentration camp, where they were never heard from again. In his testimony, the surprising resignation in Becker's voice in the face of great injustice is evident. No trace of anger or sadness, just a slight feeling of indifference. Knowing full well that his actions were illegal, he carried them out anyway. He took the consequences and showed amazing resilience. His story stands out not only for the cruelty of the discriminatory laws of the time, but also for the strength of spirit of those who were affected by them. From the age of 40, Becker becomes his own work of art. He begins to use his body as a canvas for tattoos that would eventually cover all of his skin down to below his neck. The contrast between these drawings and the image of a soft-spoken gentleman is fascinating. Gad Beck, your legs stink of Jew. The story that we will learn about below corresponds to Gad Beck, a Jewish writer who would become an icon of resistance to Nazism in Germany. I was barely 10 years old when the shadows of Nazi intolerance fell over my life. As one of the few Jewish students at my school, I was the target of anti-Semitic comments that poisoned my environment. Can I sit somewhere else? I don't want to be next to Gad. His feet reek of Jew. Echoed the words that left indelible scars on this man. In 1934, his parents decided to enroll him in a Jewish school to protect him, but the financial burden forced them to make a painful decision. At the age of 12, he had to leave school and look for work as a salesman in a store. As the son of a mixed marriage, Beck avoided the tragic fate of many German Jews who were deported to the East. He remained in Berlin, where he made the brave decision to commit to the resistance. My task was clear: help Jews escape to the safety of Switzerland. But my dual identity as a homosexual led me to seek support among those I trusted, other non-Jewish gays who shared our struggle. In early 1945, however, betrayal lurked in the shadows. In a heartbreaking twist, a Jewish spy committed to the Gestapo revealed his identity and that of some of his fellow resistance members. Gad Beck was arrested and taken to a Jewish transit camp in Berlin, where uncertainty and fear wove a dark web over his fate. At the time, Gad had begun a relationship with a man named Manfred Lewin. Although Gad was caught up in the whirlwind of the Holocaust, his love for Manfred led him to perform a bold and ingenious act to try to save him from deportation. Wearing a Hitler Youth uniform, he took the risk of convincing a commander that he needed Manfred temporarily. However, Manfred's tragic fate at Auschwitz left an indelible scar on Gad's history. In an anguishing dilemma, Gad Beck remembers the moment of the heartbreaking decision his lover made. Without hesitation, he turned around and started on his way. In those fleeting moments, watching him leave forever, Gad felt that he could no longer offer the soul determined to walk away from him. The words echoed in the air, full of resignation. "God, I can't go with you. My family needs me. If I abandon you now, I will never be free." In a context where the persecution of homosexuals was ruthless, Gad found in his guidance a clandestine tool for resistance. His network of non-Jewish homosexual contacts became an invaluable resource, providing him with food and hiding places at a time when everyday life was shrouded in horror. In the post-war period, Gad Beck became a true architect of hope and built bridges to an uncertain future. His work focused on organizing Jewish emigration to Palestine, openly defying the wishes of the British authorities. In 1947, Gad, driven by an unbreakable will, undertook the journey to Palestine himself. He did not simply witness, he actively participated in the war that would culminate in the creation of Israel in 1948. Gad, imbued with new purpose, forged a new life in the Promised Land and lived years of happiness. After the war, those affected were not the subject of investigations or compensation. They were also not recognized as victims of Nazism, as homosexuality remained illegal in the successor states of Nazi Germany. Alarmingly, upon their release, many were resentenced and transferred from concentration camps to prisons. Public rejection of this persecution emerged during the gay liberation movement in the 1970s. It was in this context that the pink triangle, previously used as a symbol of shame, was appropriated as a powerful emblem of the gay community. This change marked a significant milestone in the collective consciousness of the brutality suffered by homosexuals during the Nazi era, and underlined the importance of recognizing and commemorating the history of those who were long silenced. Did you know this symbol? Have you ever seen it nowadays? Leave us your answer in the comments box. Pierre Seel, Screams in the Night. In the dark days of World War II, the unique story of Pierre Seel emerges, the last testimony of our video. A French victim who breaks her silence about his harrowing experience during deportation because of his sexual orientation. Born in the idyllic family castle in Haguenau, Pierre, he was the fifth and last child of a wealthy Alsatian Catholic family. As a teenager, Pierre Seel rebelled against the moral restrictions of his family. He attributed his homosexuality to the repression imposed by the Catholic morality of his home, turning him into an irascible young man. Pierre's fate took a tragic turn in 1939, when, at age 16, he was the victim of a robbery in the Square Steinbach, a public garden known as a meeting place for men. When he reported the incident to the police, he was unaware that his name would be registered on the list of homosexuals maintained by the security force, a grim omen of the horrors to come. Since 1792, homosexuality in France was not illegal and was only recriminalized by the Vichy regime in 1942. The German invasion in 1940 shattered Pierre's aspirations to study fabric manufacturing in Lille. However, he completed his training in accounting, decoration, and sales, and sought a modest job as a salesman in his neighborhood, oblivious to the nightmare that would soon consume him. On May 3, 1941, Pierre Seel's life sails into darkness. Arrested, tortured, and brutally raped with a broken wooden ruler, his ordeal was just beginning. After being transferred to the Schirmeck-Vorbrück camp, 30 kilometers away, west of Strasbourg, Pierre wore on his prisoner uniform the infamous blue bar, indicative of Catholics and asociales, different from the aforementioned pink triangle that was not used in Schirmeck. In that inhospitable corner, solidarity faded like a distant dream for homosexual prisoners. These individuals were relegated to the lowest caste of prison society, often being victims of brutality perpetrated by their own fellow prisoners. Seel's story plunges into the abyss of his worst test. In a cruel execution, The Appellplatz echoed with screams and barking as the prisoners were forced into a square. A boy, Joe, Pierre's lover, was brought to the center. Naked and with a tin bucket on his head, tragedy unfolded. Classical music blared from the speakers as the SS men unleashed ferocious German shepherds on Joe. The scene of inhuman brutality remained etched in Pierre's memory. The young man was bitten, devoured, while his screams of agony were amplified by the bucket imprisoning his head. On November 6, 1941, after months of suffering famine, abuse, and forced labor, Pierre Seel was released without explanation and declared a German citizen. Pierre Seel's story appears in the documentary Paragraph 175, which deals with the deportations of homosexuals. Upon his first return to Germany, he received a rapturous ovation at the documentary's premiere at the Berlin International Film Festival. During the Nazi era, the perception towards homosexuals was that they represented weak and effeminate men, considered incapable of contributing to the fight for the German nation. However, the attitude for women was different. Lesbianism was not so persecuted, since it was understood that, despite everything, the women involved could still have children. Ultimately, the goal was procreation, the creation of a society capable of engendering a new, pure, and unique humanity that would eradicate what they considered a scourge. While relationships between men were persecuted to death by law, lesbianism was conceptualized as a temporary and curable disorder. Yes, you heard right. It was considered a temporary and curable disorder. This contrast in the persecution of different sexual orientations denotes the distortion and discrimination rooted in Nazi ideology, which sought to impose its notions of purity and superiority on society. The shocking testimony of these men reveals the fierce struggle of gay individuals against a homophobic regime. And the surprising thing is that this narrative is not an isolated case. The rawness of these aberrant events persists today, showing that, even in the 21st century, the battle against discrimination and homophobia continues to challenge communities in different corners of the world. Jews were not the only victims of the cruel and savage racism promoted by Nazism during World War II. When Adolf Hitler and his party came to power in 1933, there were thousands of black people living in Germany. The Nazi regime discriminated against them, considering them racially inferior, little more than animals. During the Third Reich's rule, racial laws and policies were implemented to restrict the economic and social opportunities of blacks in Germany. That was just the beginning, as they also harassed, imprisoned, sterilized, and killed a large number of black people, the extent of which remains unknown to this day. In today's video, we will explore the racial persecution of Afro-descendants in Germany, a topic often overlooked when discussing the Holocaust, but one that is still a fresh and unhealed wound. Welcome to Military History. Over 100 years ago, in the early 1920s, one of the most atrocious defamation campaigns in history began. A series of fake news aimed at sowing hatred among the German civilian population against blacks. It was the infamous strategy known as the Black Shame, which depicted the humiliation and disgrace that the presence of French troops of color in the Rhineland, one of the consequences of the Treaty of Versailles after World War I, meant for the white and pure German people. For the French, the inclusion of black soldiers from their African colonies, especially Senegal, had been very advantageous. They proved to be fierce and brave in combat. When the war ended and France took control of a German area along the Rhine, as part of the punishment agreed upon in the treaty, they decided to station their black soldiers there, giving them control and administration authority over the local citizens. This terrified and outraged the German inhabitants, leading the Weimar government, which emerged after the monarchy's fall, to respond with a repulsive advertising and ideological campaign. Dozens of books, periodicals, brochures, posters, flyers with drawings and photographs of guerrillas attacking locals were printed throughout Germany. They were accompanied by fabricated news about alleged attacks by French soldiers on innocent women, raped and defiled by the so-called dark monsters. They were also accused of bringing completely unfamiliar and exotic sexual customs and diseases to civilized people. The premise was simple and direct. Portray people of color as the wildest of beasts. The campaign lasted for several years and fueled the rising racism that was becoming more apparent, based on the insane racial beliefs that Nazism was about to inject into public opinion to carry out the eugenic extermination that would unfold a few years later. However, another chapter of hatred towards the Afro-descendant population was still to come. White women in the Rhineland who had relationships with black French soldiers were the target of another moral sanctioned strategy of the time, known as white shame. These Saxon women and their mixed-race children were persecuted, confined, cornered, and later killed, first by the Weimar government and finally by the Nazis. But this would happen a few more years later. As we will see below, in addition to the racial aspect, there was a component of humiliation and shame in German hatred.
The
Afro-German children born from these relationships were in a tough position. They were a reminder of the defeat in the war. They were a reminder of the French occupation force. And they reminded people of the inability of German men to protect their women from alleged rapists. That means that the authorities already had these children in their sights by the mid-1920s. They were perceived as a potential threat.
The children of black soldiers and German women were called Rhineland bastards. The Nazis, who were at that time only an incipient political movement, considered them a threat to the purity of the German race. In Mein Kampf, Hitler made it clear in his thoughts on these individuals and foreshadowed what would be the fate of people of color under his terrifying totalitarian regime. It was the Jews who brought blacks to the Rhineland, with the obvious aim of ruining the white race they detest, and with the logical consequence of bastardizing it. The primary hatred towards the different has existed since time immemorial, but in this case, it marked the beginning of the madness that the German idea of the superior race represented, leading first to Nazism and later to World War II. Saying it this way does not convey the same as hearing it from someone who lived the nightmare firsthand.
When I was a child, people would scratch my face with a scrubbing brush to show other children that it wasn't chocolate on my face. Obviously, as a child, I couldn't figure out why this was happening to me. I just wanted to be white, to have the feeling of belonging and be like the others.
Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party began to turn their discriminatory and racist ideas into law and practice when they came to power in 1933. The Third Reich aimed to create a racially pure Germany, considering Germans as members of a superior group, the Aryan race. The enemies of racial purity were Jews, Gypsies, and blacks, groups the Nazis considered subhuman. In this context, laws were passed to limit the rights of non-Aryan Germans, with the main goal of excluding these groups from social and political life, putting them on the brink of extermination, an action that would be effectively carried out years later. In September 1935, the Nazi regime announced the Nuremberg laws, which institutionalized the horrific Nazi ideas about race. These laws initially targeted Jews, but from November of that year, they also applied to Roma and blacks, derogatorily referred to by the regime as gypsies, blacks, and their bastards. There were mainly two Nuremberg racial laws. The first, the Reich citizenship law, defined a German citizen as a person of German blood or related to German kinship. The second was the law for the protection of German blood and German honor, which prohibited racial mixing, or what the Nazis called racial dishonor. The goal was to exclude people the regime considered racially inferior from having political rights in Germany and to prevent impure offspring, staining the Aryan lineage. Some years later, the totalitarian regime would go even further and propose monstrous and invasive legislations, as will be explained below.
This was called the Law for the Prevention of Offspring with Hereditary Diseases of July 14, 1933, published by one of the SS's favorite publishing houses, Lehmann's, in 1934. It contains the entire legal text and who was responsible for what. This inhumane legislation was purely about sterilization, and its aim was to legalize and legitimize eugenic, forced mass sterilization.
For Black Germans, Nazism was a time of increasing persecution, marginalization, and isolation. Although they had faced segregation during the Weimar era, the institutionalized racism of the National Socialist regime made life even more difficult and precarious for Afro-Germans and their families. Many white Germans embraced the ideology of the Third Reich and openly discriminated against people of color on their own initiative. Dismissals, evictions, and extreme poverty were the norm for this discriminated race. Some Black individuals recall life in Nazi Germany as a time when strangers spat on them in the street and racially insulted them with impunity, even celebrated by the government and common people. The Nuremberg laws made it difficult for Afro-descendants in Germany to marry, form families, or even build a future. Contrary to the regime's dictates, some Blacks had romantic relationships with German citizens. These relationships were dangerous, especially if the couples decided to try to marry legally, as the regime required everyone to seek permission to marry. When interracial couples submitted their application, they were systematically denied for discriminatory reasons and often had disastrous consequences for the pair. In multiple cases, marriage requests resulted in harassment, persecution, and imprisonment. Legal couples, whose marriages predated the Nuremberg laws, were harassed by the Nazi regime, which pressured white German women to divorce their Black husbands by offering them better living conditions. The Nazi government promoted moral sanctions against interracial couples and their children, who were insulted and even attacked when appearing together in public. For Black children in Nazi Germany, schools became places of humiliation, where they were degraded in racial science classes and ridiculed by National Socialist teachers.
I felt as if I was worth so much less than the other children there. I was hid, locked up in rooms, and when I was 10, they tried to drive the devil out of me. I was worth so little that if they could get the devil out of me, then I'd be worth a little bit more. That's how I felt.
However, school bullying would not last long, as in March 1941, the Nazi regime formally excluded Black children from public schools in Germany, seeking to isolate them from society and turn them into outcasts. The economic and social restrictions imposed on Black Germans made everyday life extremely difficult and unstable. For Afro-descendants, it became nearly impossible to make a living and support their families. Those luckier ones ended up employed as sailors or servants of the lowest category, but at least German society found them useful. A less honorable way was to work as artists in the entertainment industry, considered one of the only options for many in the community, even if it meant earning a pittance and being constantly degraded and scorned. In most cases, they perpetuated the stereotype of a wild, lustful, and dangerous person of color promoted by the Third Reich. This perspective not only reinforced German society's prejudices against this minority, but also generated resentment among the Blacks themselves, who were insulted in these representations. The less fortunate and more desperate members of this marginalized group ended up working as circus performers or as part of repugnant shows commonly called human zoos. The Third Reich not only sought to humiliate and separate the races it considered inferior, but also wanted to erase them from the map. As mentioned earlier, before the final solution of the Holocaust, the Nazis planned for these supposedly inferior humans not to reproduce. Sterilization is a procedure that makes a person unable to conceive or have children. During Hitler's rule, hundreds of thousands of people, including those with disabilities, Roma, and Afro descendants, were forcibly sterilized. Nazi leaders believed that these people posed threats to the health, strength, and purity of the Aryan race, so they wanted to eliminate them at the root. Forced sterilization is now considered a war crime and a crime against humanity under international law, but at that time, it was not classified in the criminal code, mainly because no regime had dared to do so. The ultimate goal of this imposed and violent castration of black individuals was to prevent what Hitler and his followers considered a race mixing, which, in theory, ruined the genetic path toward the German Superman pursued by Nazi scientists. Thus, in conjunction with the Nuremberg laws preventing interracial marriages, the National Socialists performed invasive and harmful surgical interventions on the bodies of Afro descendants to prevent future generations of blacks in a pure and superior Germany. However, sometimes castrations also turned into murders and disappearances, as documented in the following testimony.
Germans were sterilizing or castrating all colored men with German nationality. A few weeks later, a colored friend of mine was summoned to the Gestapo headquarters in Frankfurt. I never saw him again.
The Nazi sterilization campaign against people of color was so horrific that it is difficult to imagine. In the mid-1930s, a secret faction of Hermann Göring's Gestapo coordinated a sinister and savage program of forced castration of multiracial children in the Rhineland. As you hear it, the monstrous Nazis sterilized children. According to official medical records of the time, Reich doctors tracked and forcibly subjected a minimum of 385 children and adolescents to this procedure by the end of 1937, although it is suspected that the number could have been much higher. It was also corroborated in the same documentation that none of the infants and girls forced into this torturous operation were sexually active. They were just children with their whole lives ahead of them. During World War II, Nazi policies against blacks became even more extreme. This happened in the context of a broader radicalization of Third Reich policies against supposed racial and political enemies. As a consequence, many blacks ended up imprisoned in asylums, prisons, hospitals, psychiatric facilities, and ultimately concentration and extermination camps. All of this was promoted by a well-oiled propaganda system engineered by Goebbels, condemning not only German blacks, but also colored enemies, as explained in the following video.
Nazi propaganda worked very centrally at this time. So Goebbels was on the phone, off the phone with Hitler, immediately gave the orders, and the next day articles kept appearing about savage African soldiers who were cutting to pieces German prisoners in France.
While Auschwitz, Buchenwald, and most of the infamous sites of the Nazi genocide were built for Jews and Roma, they also had a small but significant presence of people of African descent. In most records justifying their detention there, it is stated that being biracial or of black race was a sufficient condition to be forced into forced labor within these horror complexes. It is true that the greatest aversion was directed at Jews, but people of color suffered the same fates as everything the Nazis despised. There is a fact as outrageous as it is surprising, and that is that Germans saw blacks directly as animals. There was a logic in which instead of exterminating them like the Hebrew people, they believed they could get more benefit by studying them and conducting genetic experiments with them, which are still unverified rumors, but they remain plausible. Especially in Buchenwald, it is said that it was a common practice to take a black prisoner to the infirmary for a routine analysis, and no one would ever hear from him again. There are multiple documented experiences of black people imprisoned in concentration camps. Among the many reports are men and women incarcerated and killed in Sachsenhausen, Buchenwald, and Ravensbrück.
arbeitsbedingt nach den Staaten zurückgegangen, ist dann wieder zurückgekommen und ist 1942, als dann der Krieg, also 1941, als der Krieg anfing, ist er dann verhaftet worden und ist dann ins KZ gekommen, ist in Auschwitz nur offizielle Meldung keine, aber so über Mund zu Mund ist er in Auschwitz ums Leben gekommen.
Others managed to survive and left memories and testimonies of their experience. In recent years, commemorative plaques called Stolperstein, which translates to stumbling stones, dedicated to black victims of Nazi persecution and murder, have been designed and distributed throughout Germany. Scholars continue to research and discover the stories of black victims of the Third Reich persecution, which have not been studied as much and are rarely discussed. According to historians, it is essential to be cautious about isolating anti-Semitism from all other forms of intolerance and hatred in human relationships, as there is a risk of not understanding Hitler's racial superiority phenomenon in all its dimensions. The stories of suffering by Afro-descendants help to understand a bit more about the far-reaching impact and tragic consequences of Nazi ideology for individuals and entire communities. And thus, we come to the end of today's video. Share your opinions in the comments below. Now, we thank you for accompanying us and look forward to seeing you in the upcoming episodes of Military History.